A little bit this morning. There's some question about how to get things to schedule and where to fill out schedule information, such as U-value and operation. I'll also quickly cover if we need to add additional information to the schedules. So the first thing to note is I've got a sample window showing in the floor plan here. It's just a basic window from the favorites, this casement window here. And notice that nothing's being scheduled right now. The thing we need to check is the schedule scheme settings. So these values here are what's actually showing in the schedule columns, obviously. And we see that U value shows up there, quantity, size, etc. The schedule scheme is basically saying these things will or won't schedule. So if it's a door or a window, it'll schedule. If its library part name is not empty window. So anything that's defined as an empty window will not schedule. If its element ID does not contain X, so that's a great catch-all for I don't want this window to schedule, I don't want this door to schedule, just define it as X. And then most importantly, its classification is window, and that's what allows us to model a door, for example, and define it as a window so that it shows in the schedule. But now to get this to schedule, I need to make sure that that window meets all of this criteria. So let's take a look at that window in the floor plan and troubleshoot what's going on here. So obviously it's not an empty opening. Obviously its element ID is not X. I have it defined as 100. And it is a window part. So the only thing left is this classification. And that's an easy thing to overlook, but this is really part of the critical information management of the IHC template, is this classification. That's what allows us to define, the default here comes up as beam for some reason, but we can define this window as anything. We want to make sure that this window is in fact defined as a window. The reason that this is most important is because whatever this classification is determines the information set that we can attach to this window. So we have this IDs and categories bit here, and if we scroll down here we see that there's a section for openings and there's a section for glazing. Now if we switch it back to a beam, define this as a beam, you'll notice that we lose those openings and glazing sections because obviously a beam doesn't have openings and glazings. So I'm going to switch it back to a window now. That's where I'm going to see these pieces come up. So I see that it's defined as U.3, it's defined as an awning window by default. So now if I say OK and come back into the schedule, I can see that that shows up with a U value here. It shows up with its operation as an awning. I can add additional custom notes. These are derived directly from the rough opening and unit size are derived directly from the unit itself. So if I add a rough opening, it's going to increase the size of the unit. Quantity is derived from how many of these identical units because I'm merging those items. Element ID obviously is controlled at the element level. But now let's take a look at these operation and U value points. Those are actually managed as we saw here at the individual element level under the properties. So I can come back down here and I could say that I want this U value to be, say, 0.35 or something like that, or this is obviously a casement window. Notice the broken link here. So that's what allows me to say that these have a default setting. So let's say I have 3 windows in my project. Maybe it's a small shed or a garage or something like that, and I have 3 identical windows in a project. The default values, if they're all awnings, is fine. I could say that that's globally, they're all going to be awnings. But this one, for example, I want this to be a casement. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to change this to casement. Come back in here, sorry, one more time. Notice that link is now broken. So now that's defined as a casement. When I come into the schedule, I'm going to see I have 3 awning windows and 1 casement window. Now maybe I want all windows to be casement by default. And this is really where that property comes in handy, is if I have a default setting that most or all elements of that type get applied to them, I can change them globally without having to go through individual element by individual element and adjust them. So I'm going to go to Options and Property Manager here. When I go to the property manager, I see the same list, but it's a little bit more extensive because it includes all properties for the entire project. And this is where I could see that this U value is applied to things that are defined as doors and windows by their classification. Um, so here I see that 0.30. Maybe every window in the project is 0.35 instead. I can change that default value. Maybe most of my windows are fixed. I can come in here and say that almost all windows are fixed, and redefine the defaults for those. If you have other things like maybe most windows are tempered, I can define those as safety glass, or even add additional safety glass options such as laminated glass. Um, uh, we have a category there as well, but we can combine some of those into a single set. So you can customize these things globally throughout the project. Now when I come back into the window schedule, let's go back into our window settings here. So we changed those defaults. Now when we look at, we've got 0.35 there. Let's refresh that schedule. Come back into the window schedule. We should see that update to 0.35, and I can see the default for these ones changed to casement, or changed to fixed. Now if I wanted all of them to be back to awning, I can even change that directly in the schedule, and maybe my awnings are 0.32 and my casement is still the default 0.35. So when I take a look at those now, I go into the settings here of that window. I can see that the default has been changed here as well, and I get that broken link. Maybe this one is going to be restored back to the default, so I just click there and I say that that's the default setting again. And maybe this one is a picture window. And coming back into that window schedule again, I could see that all of those have been affected. So they can be changed here as well as at the window level. Now let's say I had a jurisdiction that needed me to call out egress, for example. If I need to add a criteria to the window schedule here to define whether a window is egress or not, I can go up to my property manager, again under options and property manager. I can go into my openings. I do have a fire egress here, and it's just a true-false statement. The important thing to note is that this is defined to be used with classifications of the windows, the doors, and the curtain walls. So because we already have that in here, we don't need to add it. And again, that classification is just what we define here as what that element's being used as. So I can add that back in here. So coming into scheme settings, I can add a field under my properties, under openings. I have fire egress right here. So I can add a new property to my list, a new value to my list. And I could say OK. And now I see the default for these is that they're not egress. And that makes sense because things like picture windows and most awning windows are not going to meet egress, but maybe my casement window is an egress window. So I just check that box right there, and right in the schedule I get a new field for my windows to include an egress column. And you can create any number of new properties as you need them. The important thing to note is that you're clicking in the section here before you create a new section or a new property. And maybe I want to list something like glass thickness or number of panes or something like that. I can add a new property in here to say I want to have glass thickness. I do need to define which classifications this is going to apply to. If it's set to none, I'm not going to actually be able to apply this to any element. So I want to add classifications. I want to be able to say that this gets applied to windows, and this gets applied to doors. So I'm just going through and checking doors, windows, and we might as well add curtain walls in there, even though we don't necessarily use those. So now glass thickness is a default value for these classifications. And we can add the default thickness for that glass. Maybe it's like 5/8 of an inch or something like that for a double pane window. Um, you can build out these properties as much or little as you need to. But the important thing to note is that these are all controlled by the properties. If you're not seeing them in your schedule, it's probably because the window has not been defined as a window by its classification. I hope that explains that, and I'll try and follow up again a little bit later with more information when I can. Thanks.